Look at that.
Big thanks to Bernhard for sponsoring this episode.
Today I'm going to show you how to make Alabama brisket roll tide. And therefore I selected a beautiful brisket. Well, actually it's not my top favorite brisket because my top favorite brisket is Australian Wagyu. However, taking into consideration that this financially might not be the time that it's all about expenditure and getting the craziest thing, I'm gonna take a fairly modest brisket. It still has a good amount of intermuscular fat, it's still affordable, and more importantly, it just looks freaking good. Well, this is a brisket that hasn't been trimmed yet. Looking at the top, this is the bottom. Here we got the flat, here we have the point, and if you look at the amount of intermuscular fat at the point, it is crazy. It looks absolutely fantastic. But if we take a look at the flat sitting right here, you can see that it's a lot leaner piece, and it's something that we're going to take into consideration while we're cooking this. First thing that I want to do is trim this up to make it look like a good brisket. I'm cooking for flavor, which means I want my brisket to taste good for me at home. I don't care about that smoke ring. Even though I like it, it looks good, I'd much rather have a good amount of flavor. And if I leave a little bit of fat on, that's gonna taste freaking delicious on my brisket. So I do want a little bit of fat. Does that mean I'm gonna leave everything on? No. I'm gonna trim part of it off so I have a thin layer of fat sitting on top of this brisket. And with about 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeters layer of fat still sitting on top, this brisket is gonna be well protected. Now I'm gonna take a look at the bottom because we got some decision making. If you look here, you see some of that fat sitting, which can be amazing as well, but I still want my so beloved smoke ring. So I'm gonna trim this completely clean, so I got a nice red meat surface, and there's a hard chunk of fat sitting right here that needs to go. This fat won't render down, and I wanna take off as much of it as I can. If you want to make the trimming on your brisket easy, you should invest in a good knife. Preferably a deboning knife like this. This one is from Forged, and as the name implies, it's a hand-forged knife that does an amazing job on my brisket. I'm going to use that thin blade and stick it underneath a little bit of fat and then work my way along that fat, cutting it off, slicing it in thin layers. And you need this kind of knife to do an accurate job and not completely butcher the brisket. And that's how I trimmed the fat of my brisket. Now all I need to do is take a good look at the brisket and see how I'm gonna cook it. Because we got the flat laying here, this is the bottom side of the brisket, and we have this piece of flat sitting right here. This is a fatty floppy bit with very little meat. Now that's gonna mean one thing. This piece is going to be on and it's going to be dry, and that's going to be a waste. I can have better use out of this when I put this in my burger. So I'm going to take this piece and cut that off and save it for my burgers. I love these scraps. They make the best mincemeat. It would be a real shame if I put this on the barbecue, dry it out, and then in the end maybe toss it because it doesn't taste great. Now my brisket is perfect. I got a clean, flat, and a fatty, well-protected point with a well-protected flat on top. I'm not gonna throw these trimmings away. This is gonna be part of the cooking process. Trim your brisket, save it, then take a cast iron pan, put the fat in the pan, turn on the heat, set it to a low temperature, and let that fat melt, turning it into beef tallow. All this brisket needs now is a little bit of salt and pepper. So I'm gonna start with some fleur de sel, which is a light sea salt. And this is a big chunk of meat, so don't be shy with that seasoning. I do want a lot of pepper on my brisket. Now, of course, this is very personal, but I like the salt to pepper ratio to be 10:1. Before I flip this brisket around, I'm gonna let it sit for around 10 minutes so that the moisture that sits in the meat can connect with the dry rub. That way it sticks way better, and you're gonna have a better bark in the end. The fat cap gets exactly the same treatment, thin layer of salt and a lot of black pepper to finish it off. And the good thing about this seasoning is that it's very affordable compared to store-bought barbecue rubs. Now it's time to fire up my Bernhard smoker and I'm going to set it to smoke at a temperature of 120 degrees Celsius. Of course, I also want to check on my pellets, making sure that I have enough pellets for my brisket cook. And since I'm using the 4-2-10 method, I'm looking for, have I got enough pellets in my hopper for the first 4 hours smoking at 120 degrees Celsius. And this might just be enough, but I want to add a little bit just to make sure. I'm going to put my brisket on with the fat cap pointing down, and I set it up so that the fat cap sits at the bottom. So that's going to protect the meat from the heat that comes from the bottom. And I also have the thickest part of the brisket pointing towards the hottest part of the grill. I'm going to close the lid and let it cook for 4 hours. Yeah. The first phase of 4 hours smoking has gone by, and what do we see here? Even though the brisket was laying with the top pointing towards the bottom, we still have that puddle effect. And that puddle needs to go, otherwise it's gonna affect our bark. I'm also gonna check my pellets, and it's definitely ready for a refill. And I'm going to raise up the temperature to 140 degrees Celsius. Now technically we're roasting that brisket, but we're only going to do it for 2 hours, which is going to raise up the temperature in the barbecue, build up and dry out that crust. After another 2 hours of smoking, I'm going to lay out my butcher paper and I'm going to apply this fat. That's the fat that we trimmed off this brisket, ran it down in a cast iron pan until it was fully molten, and put through a sieve and filter out all the chunky bits. And then it's time for the grand moment to put that beautiful brisket in the butcher paper. And now the 4-2-10 method requires some humidity. I'm going to add a little bit of water to this tray, and I have a rack sitting at the bottom of this tray. So the brisket won't be touching that water. That water's just there to create a moist environment. Then I'm going to cover it and seal it off with aluminum foil. And there we have it, a perfect package, and that's going to go in my oven in the house at a temperature of 65 degrees Celsius for at least 10 hours. Straight out of the oven, ready to be eaten, 65 degrees Celsius, and we rolled it for 12 hours. So that's well over the 10-hour mark that we needed. Let's take a look. There we go. The paper was sitting on top, on the rack, not touching all of that goodness that sits inside. Don't throw this away, and I know I say this every time, but this is magic. Let's open up that butcher paper and take a look at this brisket. Whoa, that is one beautiful brisket. That is a good looking brisket, nice bark with that pepper. Looks amazing, so very promising so far. But this Alabama brisket isn't done yet. We need an Alabama brisket sauce. I'm gonna make it with 250 milliliters of mayonnaise, 65 milliliters of apple cider vinegar, a tablespoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of garlic powder, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 3 tablespoons of pickle juice, 1 tablespoon of coarse black pepper, and 1 tablespoon of horseradish. Finish it off with a tablespoon of Worcester sauce, mix it up, roll tide. And just like with the Alabama white sauce and chicken, my brisket is getting covered. I want to get that stuff all over my brisket. This is a beautiful sauce that's going to balance out some of that fat that sits in the brisket. It's going to make it rich and creamy, and that's why I'm calling this the Alabama brisket. Let's carve into this beautiful brisket and take a look inside. Look at that. Beautiful smoke ring, awesome brisket. One gorgeous brisket. Of course, I want to slice out of that. We got a beautiful smoke ring on this brisket. Look at that. Absolutely gorgeous. We got a good pull. That 4-to-10 method worked its miracle. And look at how good this looks. Alabama white sauce, bark, smoke ring, juicy meat. What else do you want? Thank you guys for watching.